Hello, this is Sherry Fletcher, and today we're going to be looking at the cemeteries of Sierra County. There are a number of cemeteries in Sierra County. In fact, the number is about 30. And if one is looking for gravestones, there are 2 websites that are available, and if one just types the person's name in, that would help them determine where they're located in our county. Many times we have found that graves have nothing but initials on it to mark the passing. We find in New Mexico the sun, the cold nights, coupled with moisture, has broken down many of the handmade markers found in our rural communities and in our rural cemeteries. We have included here a list of the cemeteries, and also at times we have noted if they are on private land, and we will go into more detail about that later. One of the interesting pieces was the cemetery at Fort McRae, which has been relocated, and the 14 individuals that were there have now been sent to various areas, some back to Washington, D.C. for internment. Fort McRae was located on the Elephant Butte Lake on the west side of McRae Canyon at the water's edge, and it was established in April 3rd, 1863 to protect the trail on the El Camino Real. The fort was named for a Captain Alexander McRae, who died in the Battle of Valverde, which is north of us. Fort McRae was abandoned in October 30th, 1876, and it now is covered by the lake. Internments of people that were buried there are relocated either at the national level, the state, public, or private cemeteries. Captain McRae's remains, first interred at Fort McRae, were removed, and he was buried at West Point on June the 5th of 1867 as he was a graduate. On October the 18th, on March 18, 1993, 14 military individuals in a stretch limo visited the McRae Cemetery with the intention of digging up and locating the other 27 graves, one being a Buffalo soldier who had served at Fort McRae. We have listed here the list of individuals who died during their service and while they were stationed at Fort McRae. There are some that would indicate that they were killed by disease, accidentally shot, or killed by Native Americans during the Apache Wars. The town of Array was established in about 1890, and it was initially called El Bonito. It is not known what year the cemetery started, but ironically, the first recorded death is William Bonney in 1897. Ingle Cemetery is on private land. Here's a couple of the graves, and here is a view looking of the cemetery at Ingle, and there are probably 25 or 30 graves at that site. Some of the pictures below give the names of the individuals that are buried in that cemetery. Again, it's on private land. This is a good example of how the hot New Mexico sun and the cold winds will erase all names of individuals whose names were etched into a wooden cross. The Apodaca Family Cemetery in Las Palomas, the Armijos Family Cemetery, also in Las Palomas. The Cavalla Cemetery, which is named after a little town approximately 15 miles south of Truth or Consequences on Highway 187, it is still an active cemetery. It is a typical Western cemetery, and if one stops at the Cavalla store, one can have directions how to find the cemetery. The Cheese Cemetery is located beyond Winston. Take a dirt road. One must go through private property. The ranch owner is usually at home, but it is on private land. Vigi Trujillo is buried at the Cheese Cemetery, which is named after Cochise, as he was in that area and made friends with the Trujillos. Vigi Trujillo was a very active native New Mexican who was a post office individual. Here's a picture of Vigi with his friends. Again, our purpose is to place a name to a stone. Vigi was an advocate in having all individuals be able to read and write in Spanish as well as in English. Here's a list of the individuals buried in the Cheese Cemetery. Chloride has two cemeteries. And as we know, chloride was started in the 1880s when silver was discovered in the area. According to one local resident, the origin of the Chloride Cemetery was a grave of a 7-month-old baby. Today, mining activity has been renewed in the little town, but there are still a few buildings and a handful of people. The Chloride Centennial Cemetery is also located on the bluffs above Chloride, and where the Greenwood Cemetery going into Chloride is on the left-hand side. The Chloride Centennial Cemetery is on the right-hand side up on the bluffs. Cutter, which was a railroad town east of Truth or Consequences. The town is gone. There's a railroad sign there, and the cemetery is to the right, going toward El Alimán. The Dines Ranch Cemetery is on private property. Eugene Manlove Rhodes is located on the White Sands Missile Range. Twice a year, Eugene Manlove Rhodes' grave is open for individuals to take a caravan and to go to the site. It is in the proximity of Rhodes Canyon, which Eugene Manlove Rhodes was named after his father, and he was a writer that did a beautiful job in preserving the language and the way of thinking in his stories of the Jornada del Muerto. Also, Rhodes Hall at New Mexico State University was named after Eugene Manlove Rhodes. Hermosa is a Western-style cemetery, and individuals were being buried there from the 1880s on. Hillsboro Community Cemetery is 1 mile south of Hillsboro. It sits on a hill overlooking the town. There are many unmarked graves, but yet it holds a rich history. Lake Valley, which is located south of the old mining town of Lake Valley. Lake Valley holds the most of the Confederate States of America markers than any of the other cemeteries in Sierra County. Nun Ranch Cemetery is on private property. Percha Creek Cemetery, which was once called Danville, is located northeast of Kingston. Saco Creek Cemetery is on an old homestead. 3 of the graves have no markings. Vista Memorial Cemetery currently still accepts individuals that are being buried in that area. Dr. Hubble gave the land in 1972 to the city, and it was the land of his ranch, and some say it was a way that allowed Dr. Hubble to be buried on his ranch. Dr. Hubble also was a very prominent individual in Truth or Consequences and delivered many babies in the area. Latham, Robert James Latham, is one of the individuals who is buried at Lake Valley and told his family that he didn't feel well. His wife put his feet in a bucket of water. He laid down to rest, and he had a heart attack and died. And he was a private in the Texas Rangers, and after his enlistment, he married Elizabeth Faulkner from the area. And here's his picture of his grave. Harvey Ringer was born in Missouri, came to Fairview, which is now Winston, in 1881. He was a owner of the Hermosa Cattle Company, which headquartered in the North Percha area near Hillsboro. He provided beef for the miners in the area. And here's an example of his stone, which is in Lake Valley Cemetery. Sadie Orchard, and here's her stone. While she was an advocate and felt passionately about Hillsboro, brought on the lawsuit to stop the moving of the county seat from Hillsboro to Hot Springs. She is buried in Hot Springs and not her beloved Hillsboro. There is speculation as to why that is, one being that when she died in 1943, there was no one available to dig her grave in the rocky terrain of the Hillsborough Cemetery. Therefore, she's buried in the Hot Springs Cemetery on Cedar Street. Here lies the body of Ernest Bonner, still gun in hand. He was mortally wounded following a gunfight with his partner in business, Hart Darish. Both men fired their guns at point blank. Both men were business partners in the amusement business, which in the late 40s and the early 1950s was one-armed bandits, which was a form of a slot machine, and other types of gambling that was available in Hot Springs. Here's where Ernest Bonner is buried, very close to Hart Darish. Thelma Tartan was a lovely individual, and she is buried very close, had a very colorful history, and she was buried very close to where Darish and Bonner are buried in the Hot Springs Cemetery on Cedar Street. Through the years, vandalism has taken its toll on some of the beautiful stones. Metates have been used in some of the cemeteries to etch names in. This is an example of a beautiful stone in the Monticello Cemetery. Here is a single grave with, again, the winds taking the name of the person who is buried here. This is up going toward Poverty Creek. These are early stones from Cachio. Some stones that are etched in sandstone may just have initials on them, have been lost in time. Juan Neposinimo Trujillo Montoya, this is his stone located in the Monticello Cemetery. Jim Gilliland, who died in some of the apartments here in Hot Springs in 1947. He is buried over in Carrizosa, but again, his history, along with McNew and Oliver Lee for the trial of the missing and a presumed killing of Colonel Fountain and his son. This is his stone from the cemetery in Carrizosa. An example of the early Hot Springs Cemetery when it was relocated to Cedar Street. These are some of the early families. The stone, the rock work that now surrounds the cemetery on Cedar Street was all CCC or WPA work, and it's a beautiful type of artwork, of stonework that protects our loved ones who are buried in that cemetery. Here's the type of individuality that families do and are allowed to do in our cemetery, which, while to some people in the Midwest that are used to green cemeteries, that they can, in our old cemetery, Hot Springs Cemetery, keep the flowers up year long, and they have individuality as to how they want to build the stone in commemoration of their loved one. Here's a letter from Clinton Stanfield, whose family built the one cemetery stone of the rocks, and talked about his family that is buried in our cemetery on Cedar Street. This is the picture of that stone. All styles of stones are welcomed in the cemetery. Jewel Glenn Mims was mayor of Hot Springs 4 times. He relocated during the Depression, purchased about 5,000 acres of land from Victoria Land and Cattle Company for $1.32 an acre. He still has descendants in the area, and he was affectionately known to many of us as Pop Mims. Here we can put a face to a cemetery, stone. His whole family is buried in the northwest corner of the cemetery. Tom Hobbs was a developer, and he died in 1940. This is his stone there, and Broadway Street was first named Hobbs, as many of the streets in Hot Springs were named after developers. Mr. Graham's grave is buried on a homestead west of El Alimán, which is close to the spaceport area. And here's how simple his stone and how beautiful his stone still is after all these years. Former Secretary of the State and related to J.J. Tafoya of the Buckhorn Bar, which was an early watering hole on Main Street, is also buried in the Hot Springs Cemetery.